Amen to that truth. God is love. Such a great thing. It's great to be here with you this morning. It's always an encouragement. If you weren't here last week, we are glad that you're here this week. It's a joy to gather together as a church family. We also recognize that some people can't gather, and I want to let you know, especially those who can't gather with us physically, but join in on our live stream. We actually have several people that really around the country and even around the globe that join in via live stream, and we welcome you guys too. It is a joy to be able to be together even through the distance. But it is such an encouragement to me to hear the stories of people who can't make it, whether they're homebound or whether they're just away and they join in with us. That always is an encouragement to realize that the body here is much bigger than the body here. And Christ's body spans the globe, and it's fantastic. If you weren't with us last week, I want to catch up to speed. We were talking about encouragement. We started a series talking about encouraging encouragement. And the whole idea of looking at this subject and this practice of encouragement is not simply so that we can learn more and know more about the subject. That's good to learn more and know more, but it doesn't really do much, especially with encouragement. It doesn't do much unless we actually grow in our encouragement and practice it. And so last week we talked about how to practice that in one practical way, but I hope that you carried that into other possible ways of this whole idea of being able to encourage one another, this oft-repeated phrase in Scripture. But I want to remind you that encouragement is not simply about complimenting someone, saying, oh, you look nice today, great job on the game last weekend, or any of those types of things. Encouragement is more than just a compliment, although those are encouraging. Encouragement in the New Testament is to encourage is to motivate others in the direction of Jesus. That's what we're shooting for. When we talk about encouragement as a church, we are striving to motivate others in the direction of Jesus, to be more like Him, to be more Christ-like, to be more Christian. That's what encouragement in the New Testament is shooting for. And so with that in mind, we're going to be heading to the letter of 2 Timothy. But before we get there, I think we need a little background. Paul writes this letter. It's one, if not his last letter, it's one of his very last letters that we have recorded for us. He writes it from prison in Rome, the second time he's in prison in Rome. Now, we can get the chronology of Scripture is a little kind of strange because we like to group things in. It would be a little bit weird to separate 1 and 2 Timothy from one another or some of these other things. But this timeline is you have to kind of walk through the timeline. The first Roman imprisonment that we see of Paul is at the end of the book of Acts. This is the one where he's heading there and he's going to stand trial for something that he didn't do. He is under house arrest in this imprisonment. He has people able to visit with him and talk to him, and he has every intention that he is going to be let free. He is pretty sure, and he is eventually. We don't read about that in the book of Acts, but we understand from the rest of Paul's story, he's let free from this. But by the writing of this book, he's back in prison again in Rome the second time. And this time, whenever he's in prison, it's a whole lot darker situation. Literally. He's not under house arrest anymore. He is now in a dungeon. He isn't able to be surrounded by friends and family. In fact, friends and family have abandoned him. He knows he's about to be executed. Paul knows his time on earth is coming quickly to an end. And so he is writing letters, and he's striving to use the last bit of time that he has left wisely. And that's the place. It's in that understanding, it's in that dungeon that Paul writes about the single most powerful way to encourage one another. The single most powerful way. We're going to read about it in 2 Timothy, starting in chapter 1, verse 15. It says this: As you know, everyone from the province of Asia has deserted me, even Phygellus and Hermogenes. May the Lord show special kindness to Onesiphorus and all his family, because he often visited and encouraged me. He was never ashamed of me because I was in chains. When he came to Rome, he searched everywhere until he found me. May the Lord show him special kindness on the day of Christ's return. And you know very well how helpful he was in Ephesus. So Paul here talks about a guy named Onesiphorus. Some translations say that Onesiphorus refreshed me. I always like that translation, that I was refreshed by Onesiphorus. Well, why? I mean, what did this guy do? Well, it says he often visited. He showed up. Thing is, this has more weight than we might realize. When Onesiphorus came to Rome, he was not locally in Rome. He came to Rome searching for Paul. Paul's in a dungeon. I want to let you know that they don't advertise who's at different prisons very well. Even in our day and age, they don't advertise this really well. You have to go searching somewhat or find out where they got transferred, where they are, even more so in their day and age. It wasn't like an announcement that went across the whole Roman Empire saying, all right, here's a list of prisoners and here's where they're located. If anyone wants to come and try to get one of them out, here's the address. No, the dungeon was a place where you didn't know who was there, so Onesiphorus had to go searching everywhere in Rome to find Paul. And when he found Paul, he refreshed him by visiting often. All right, so here's the whole sermon in a nutshell. All right, so here it is. I'm just going to lay this out. This is simple. Encouragement that refreshes requires authentic presence. Now, if we all got that, I would do invitation song and we'd be done. The problem is you probably get that in theory, and I have more time to preach, so I'm going to continue. Some of you are like, no, you don't, according to my watch. If we are going to refresh people, we've got to understand we need to be present. There is nothing that substitutes for presence. Nothing that substitutes for that. Jesus, in the darkest moments of his life, whenever he is at the end of his life, Garden of Gethsemane, the closest people to him, what do? They desert. They run away. Paul's dealing with the exact same situation. He is now in a dark place of his life. He's nearing the end. He's in chains, and some people are ashamed of these chains, and they desert him. Paul calls out two of them. We have every indication to believe that these two people, Phygellus and Hermogenes, are friends of Paul. They are probably co-laborers in the gospel with him. But the only thing that we know for sure about these two friends is that when Paul needed them, they weren't anywhere to be found. They abandoned him. They didn't show up. And what a shame that is. See, when you think about Paul, I want you to understand, Paul had no fear of dying for Jesus. Paul would say, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. In the future, there is a crown waiting for me. Paul had no fear of dying for Christ. But it seemed that Paul was a little concerned and discouraged about the thought, not of dying for Christ, but of dying alone. What a horrible thought. We often hear funerals that I do and things like that, you write it even in the obituaries, that they passed away surrounded by their friends and family. Don't ever take that line for granted. To me, that is one of the most beautiful lines in the obituary. It's saying they were surrounded by friends and family. Who doesn't want that? At the end of their life, you want the presence of the people who love you. Paul is discouraged, though, because now the people who seemingly loved him are gone. He talks about this again in chapter 4 of 2 Timothy. He said, the first time I was brought before the judge, no one came with me. Everyone abandoned me. And then maybe out of a godliness, a moment of godliness, he says, may it not be counted against them. But can you hear the discouragement in his voice? No one wants to be alone. No one wants to be lonely. And Paul says, look, man, I was there. Everyone abandoned. He's struggling with this. So he spends his last letter thinking about different people who have encouraged him. He's writing to Timothy, and at the beginning of Timothy, back in verses 3 and 4, he says, Timothy, I thank God for you. The God I serve with a clear conscience, just as my ancestors did. Night and day, I constantly remember you in my prayers. I long to see you again, for I remember your tears as we parted, and I will be filled with joy when we are together again. Paul is saying, hey, look, it's bleak right now. I am hurting. I am struggling. It is not a good situation, but there's a thing that gives me hope. A thing of this earth, not just simply a thing, oh, it'll be better by and by, when we all get together. No, he's saying, look, Timothy, my thoughts of you bring me joy, and I long for the day. I long for the day to be in your presence again. How many of you have had a friend like that in your life? It's kind of the friend that you haven't been around maybe for past years. It could be decades even. But then you're around them and it's like you picked up the story just immediately. There was no gap. And you just are refreshed from their presence because this is a friend that you may not see too often, but they bring you joy. See how I think Paul is talking about Timothy. Saying, you may not be around me right now, but man, that gives me hope knowing if you were. And Timothy's not the only one. He'll say in chapter 4, give my greetings to Priscilla and Aquila and those living in the household of Onesiphorus. Now, Priscilla and Aquila, I believe, and Timothy as well, I believe all three of those people, if they were in Rome, they would have been there. They would have been visiting Paul. In fact, I think they would have traveled to Rome to visit Paul if Paul had not given them a directive to stay where they're at and share the good news. But you get that impression. He's telling Timothy for sure, but he has released Priscilla and Aquila into the ministry, and he's saying, that's bigger than me. But notice for the second time, this man and his family by the name of Onesiphorus shows up. Apparently, Onesiphorus had made quite an impact on Paul. Because while everyone else was abandoning, Onesiphorus showed up. Onesiphorus may have brought food. Maybe he brought blankets. Maybe he brought a casserole, a little bit of leftover from the potluck, some fried chicken, I don't know. Maybe he brought news about the kingdom throughout the world. Things that Paul would be interested in, things that Paul might need. But none of that's recorded for us. We don't have a list of the things that Onesiphorus brought. Because I believe the point that is being made here is that the greatest gift that Onesiphorus could bring Paul was himself. He brought him the greatest gift, and that was his own presence. He may have brought other things, but his presence was there. He was clearly there. Or as I was been saying, encouragement that refreshes requires authentic presence. And the reason I stress authentic presence is because there is such a thing as inauthentic presence. I mean, someone can be there without really being there, right? Just case in point. Some of you are here physically. Okay, maybe that's hitting a little too close to home. We live in a day and age where people are more connected than ever, but have less connections than ever. We live in a day and age where we are, you can even see it, our pictures. You can see it in the thing, in our lifestyles, and you can see it when you go to any restaurant, when you go to any park, or even when you go to a game. I got to laughing at Megan Brown's post about Molly found daughter at the game, and the comment was, she had her phone in her face. Isn't this true? I'm not picking on Olivia. Here's the thing. This is the normal pose for us in America. These things are in our face. And we assume that because we are connected, because we have friends and because we have likes, that we are in community. But the thing is, that is so far from the truth. Every time that we gather, these things can be fantastic tools, don't get me wrong. Last week I even asked you to use this as a tool of encouragement to text someone. Great. Here's the thing though, we go to lunch, and how many of us are inauthentically present at the table? How many of us, whenever we go, man, I'm going to be guilty of this, I go to our kids' sporting games, and, well, they're not doing anything right now, I'll just check what's going on. I'm a horrible parent. I didn't get any amens from my girls, so yes, be all right for a bit. The thing is, in a generation that is longing for connection, we are doing everything we can to avoid it. I don't know how many, maybe most of you all don't know this, but probably some of you all, One Republic, the song Connection, man, those words are powerful, right? If you know the song, I caution you, it's One Republic. It may not be your style, and it may not have some of your words in there, but that is one fascinating song to show the epidemic of our world. Our digital world is deceiving us. In fact, the Surgeon General a few years ago, so Surgeon General to the United States a few years ago said there is an epidemic in our world. And it's not some health issue, it's not some just thing that you might think for epidemic. What he says is, here's our epidemic: loneliness. We are the most lonely people this nation has ever seen. And I think it's because we have fooled ourselves into thinking, well, I have connection. I have friends. I have people that care. They're all digital. It's kind of like me as a kid, man. I have friends. They're the imaginary ones, but they're still friends, right? A lot of our digital friends are imaginary. So the experts say, you know how to combat loneliness? The experts, of the world, the experts are saying, here's how you combat loneliness. Get involved in a community at least once a week. I laughed out loud whenever I read that. I was like, you know what? People of this world are recommending church. They just don't know it. I mean, if nothing else, the community that we have here, even if you take out the whole understanding of God, which we never should, don't get me wrong there, but even if we just gathered for simple purposes, we are going to be healthier beings by doing such. Add to that the spiritual health that we get from Christ. We should be some of the healthiest people this world has ever seen because our connections are here. And we have people in our lives in presence of each other. See, the thing is, you don't need a personal relationship with Jesus. That's a myth. You need a shared relationship with Jesus. If all it is you and Jesus, you're doing it wrong. It's got to be the church and Jesus, and you be part of that church. If all it is you and Christ, you're missing the point because you can't do it by yourself. We are lonely people because presence is a gift that everyone needs and anyone can give. If you're struggling with how important this idea of presence is, then I encourage you to consider a parable that Jesus told about sheep and goats, about the judgment day, about our future, that one day he's going to separate the sheep from the goats, and he says this to the sheep, okay? In Matthew, this is Matthew 25, he says this: the king will say to those on his right, y'all are good, come, who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. That's good news. But here's why. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, you invited me into your home. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you visited me. And now the sheep will say, man, when did we do that for you, Lord? And the Lord will say, whenever you've done it for the least of these, you've done it for me. And then he says the opposite to those who are not going to be in his presence. He says, whenever I was hungry, you didn't feed me. Now notice, there are things that are given to people here. You have food, you have clothing, you have drink. That is given, great. But notice the idea of authentic presence that is clearly located in this passage. I was in prison, you visited me. I was sick. Then, when you said a care package, no, you cared for me. I was a stranger. You invited me in. See, a lot of times what we think is that these things are enough. But that we could just provide the things for people and that's enough. But what this passage is saying is your presence is needed. In fact, what I understand from this passage is whenever we are in the presence of the king, when we show up before the king, he's going to ask, did you show up for others? Because when you show up for others, you show up for me. Everyone can think of a moment whenever they've been renewed, they've been restored, they've been rejuvenated, or refreshed, or even rescued by the presence of someone in their life. Everyone can think of one of those moments whenever that person beside you was just beside you, and it meant so much to you. See, here's the thing. You don't have to have the right words to be able to say for authentic presence. You don't have to have some master's degree in authentic presence. You don't have to have money or even some budget to have authentic presence. You need some time, and you need some presence. That's it. You need you to do this. This is so striking whenever I read stats about, the congregations the national thing. Churches are losing young people. You've heard these stats, right? When people graduate, the stats are more than half of them won't continue in a church. I mean, that's like strikingly real for me because I'm looking at a group of young people and I'm like, okay, cut them down the middle. These people won't, I can't do that fully, but saying, ouch. And we've been tempted to think, well, you know what we need to do is we need to throw a little bit more money at this program. We need to put a little bit more money into the youth program and then have another program that addresses young adults and then throw money into this because if the money's there, they will come. You know what every stat is showing? That doesn't work. The most important thing that we can do, in fact, the key indicator of whether people, not just kids, but people hang with a church is if they have authentic presence in their life. They say for every kid, you need 5 adults in their life that they can trust and they can lean upon. That's authentic presence. We all need it, and everyone can do it. And the biggest thing is so powerful. God communicates His presence through your presence. I know God is everywhere. You know that too. All right, God is everywhere. But how God chooses to communicate His presence is through the presence of one another. In fact, Matthew 18:20 says, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered together as my followers, I'm there among them." He's not simply saying, well, I'm not there if you're by yourself. What He's saying is that when 2 or 3 gather in my name, when 2 or 3 people are gathered in the name of Christ, I am felt there. When we gather with a few more than 2 or 3, here this morning, He is present because the way that God communicates His presence is through your presence. In other words, there is something that you will miss about the presence of God if you miss the presence of His people, if you don't come to fellowship. And there is something your brother or sister will miss about the presence of God if you don't show up. So show up. We need to show up for each other. And this isn't simply about when they're in the hospital. This isn't simply about when they go to prison. This is about every day. I tell you, some of the things that mean most to me is whenever you show up at the random things in my life. When people show up to a sporting event of my daughter, I'm like, oh, man, you didn't have to come. I am glad you're here. And I realize that means a lot to you as well because authentic presence means a lot to us. So this morning, as we go into our invitation, I want you to recognize that every one of us needs presence. And so if you know of someone this morning sitting in this auditorium that needs presence around them, they need your presence around them. I'm going to ask you in this invitation to walk over to them, just give them a hug and stand with them. Talk to them, whatever. Be present for them. Now, on the flip side of that, you may be saying, man, I could really use some presence, and you don't see anyone coming to you. Because that's not normal for us, right? I mean, we're used to just standing in our pews. Don't be making us go across the aisles and stuff. And no one's coming to you, and you're like, man, I could really use some presence. Then I'm going to give you an opportunity to go and find someone that you could use some presence of and just say, look, can I get a hug? Can you be here with me? And if you want to come forward to one of the elders, one of the ministers, be around us for presence, we want to welcome you. Because the thing is, we believe God communicates his presence through our presence together. So may we share God with you this morning. Would you come as we stand and as we sing?